Welcome, team, to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 9th of January 2024. It's going to be a relatively quick one today. I've said this a number of times recently, and they have been relatively quick, despite my track record for banging on way too long, far too often. Anyway, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key to the map on the screen at the moment. Otherwise, we don't have a particularly changed map. In fact, we can forget almost the entirety of the front line, apart from what is taking place in the Mariinka, Novomakilivka area to the south of the Eastern Front. Nonetheless, there is still activity going on up and down the front lines. There's a few points of discussion, analysis to be made. This is a quote from the New York Times. Again, New York Times releasing these, it's pretty difficult for the Ukrainians type articles, which is true. Just hope they give the full context. Sometimes they don't. Dashant Joshi quotes this from it. Ukrainian soldiers and commanders interviewed in recent weeks along a broad stretch of the central and eastern front said that Russian attacks were so intense that operating near the front line has never been so dangerous. So central and eastern front lines are really, really hairy at the moment. Ukrainian soldiers said that they often use FPV drones instead of artillery because shells were increasingly in short supply, and the drones are a cheap, quick weapon for attacks on nearby Russian vehicles, bunkers, and infantry. Now, there is something to say about this. We have been seeing this, and I think it is indicative of a shortage of shells. But also, I think the better choice sometimes. I was having a chat to Andrew Perpetua, and I will release the Tochny video I did. Well, it's their video, but I was on their program the other night. I'm going to release that to members tonight, and it will come out for everyone else tomorrow, just because I produced a lot of content today, so I might as well do it like that way and say thanks to the members. But anyway, I was talking in that about drones being used on the front line, and I think that they can be, and Andrew Perpetua was saying they can be the better choice of weapon because the Russians feel that in particular, the Russians feel that they're more accurate in hitting aspects of dugouts and bunkers and trenches in ways that, okay, you might get a bigger explosion with a shell from, 152mm artillery piece, but is that going to be as accurate? Is it going to be pinpoint or precision? Okay, you could use precision-guided munitions in these artillery pieces, but the Russians don't have a lot of that. And the Ukrainians neither, and they're expensive bits of kit. So go for these smaller explosives, but that will take out parts of a trench system to greater accuracy. And in fact, you can fire 5 of those drones at that little kind of dugout in the trench line, and it eliminates the people and the trench to some degree. The Russians were employing subterfuge as well. Planchet said, so someone in the article, playing tapes of gunfire on drones to make Ukrainian soldiers think they were under attack, leave the bunkers and reveal their positions. Interesting. So anyway, things are tough on the front line is, I think, the takeaway from that article. Yep, absolutely. It's going to be tough for both sides. The question is, who is it tougher for? Remember, there will be a selection bias when reading something like New York Times articles. Because, why? I mean, we might forget this, but it's actually blindingly obvious. Who can they interview? The Ukrainians. Who can they not interview? The Russians. So whose story do we always hear? The Ukrainians. Are soldiers ever happy on the front line? No, they're never happy. So who are the New York Times going to be talking to? Unhappy soldiers. Okay, so what are the types of articles we are going to read in the New York Times? Articles about unhappy soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. Okay, there you go. So it's probably quite easy to criticize the New York Times, but actually just the nature of how they're going to produce articles means that they are going to skew towards having negative feeling interviewees on the Ukrainian side. That's just how it's going to go. Now it's incumbent upon them, however, to provide the full context to what they're saying. And actually, it would be lovely in those articles if they could talk about that. But the journalists probably don't realise their own biases there. They're not taking that big picture. But for someone like me, when I talk consistently, previous to getting involved in analysing wars and stuff, I would be looking epistemologically at things from a philosophical point of view, which means truth, knowledge, etc., and looking at cognitive biases and confirmation biases and so on, and how's the data skewed, and what's this, how does this track, and how could this person be wrong, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm quite used to thinking in those terms, but just, a reporter's not going to be thinking like that. I've got a good story. I've interviewed these soldiers. Let's write it up. My editor's happy. Yep, it's all a bit negative. It's clickbaity, but that's the nature of the beast. Just bear that in mind. However, things will be tough for the Ukrainians, of course it will, but also tough for the Russians as well. Okay, we're going to go to the northeast first, really, really quickly. This is no report saying no confirmed changes on the other front lines. He talks a little bit about Mariinka. We'll get there later. Kupiansk fighting south and southwest of Liman Pershi in the forest. That we know. Avdiivka as well. They claim that Russians are trying to break through the Stepova and towards Novobakhmutivka. So this is Sinkivka up in the northeastern sector, which is up here. That's that Sinkivka area just there, as they're trying to push south towards Kupiansk. But yeah, to go back to null reports, Avdiivka trying to break through near Stepova. This is the Avdiivka cauldron, and that's up here that they're trying to push through and towards Novobakhmutivka further to north. We know that. Bakhmut fighting still near the cemetery on the O0506 towards Chaziv Yar. So this is going now back up again, but we can come down from the northeast. We'll look at the Bakhmut area, where the idea is that they are fighting around this general area of Bodanivka towards Chaziv Yar. That cemetery, can't remember now. Actually, that's that one near Avdiivka I was thinking of. But anyway, fighting around there, it is tough, but there are no changes. So as tough as it is, it's evidently equally tough for the Russians, and they are unable to fully break through. So that's really, good news for the Ukrainians. Now, here we have Global War Monitor, saying the 63rd Mechanized Brigade has advanced in the area of the Donetsk-Luhansk border, specifically in the Kremina Forest. They are now approximately 900 meters from the village of Dubrova. And I find this interesting because I've not seen this on any other sources. Sorry, I'm flicking backwards and forwards because the sources are doing that. I did want to come down, but no reports included it all together. But here we have the area where Global War Monitor is claiming that the Ukrainians have had some success, pushing right back to the edge of Dubrova. So 900 meters from Dubrova, depends where you're taking that from. So probably, pushed the Russians back. This would be their defensive line at the most. Or well, actually, no, that's incorrect. Sorry. If the Ukrainians are 900 meters from Dubrova, that means the Russians will be in Dubrova in their defensive line. So actually, this line here would be the kind of like the white line of the 30th of May before the counteroffensive started for the Ukrainians last year. That could be where the Russians now are. But of course, there's no confirmation of that claim. But interesting that the Ukrainians may be fighting back in that area. Good news again for the Ukrainians. Other than that, it's fairly static. We come down to no reports reporting about Mariinka first before we get to Novomyrkilivka. So as we come down past Avdiivka, past Pervomaisky and Nevelsky, Krasnohorivka, we get to Mariinka, where Andrew Perpetua has the Russians having some success, actually just pushing back to pretty much exactly where Surat Maps had the Russians previously. So there's a bit of mapping alignment from the two mappers there. Good news that there's agreement there. Bad news that it means that the Russians have pushed forward a little bit. Here is a kind of general summary of the last, 3 or 4 days. Russians have advanced further west of Mariinka towards Herivka. These gains are not from the last days, but likely made over the course of 2 weeks, actually, so extending that time period. Russia is entrenched at the O05110 intersection. The H15T junction is still disputed. Okay, so that is to say that elements of, dispute around this junction possibly there, which we can see that most mappers are saying is under Russian control, unless of course this is the junction that they're also talking, or he's talking about. Not too sure, but anyway, tough fighting around there. and the Russians have potentially made some gains, well, certainly over the last few weeks. Right. Now we have exactly what I said might happen today, which is Andrew Perpetua is probably going to catch up to some degree with what Surat Maps and Deep State Map were claiming was happening south of Novomikhailivka. Obviously, they map at different times, right? So it's not that Andrew Perpetua's behind the curve. It's just that actually Surat Maps has mapped at a different time, and then Andrew will be looking at all the data. Sometimes mappers are behind the curve and they might miss bits of evidence and whatnot. But hopefully that's useful for you then to show you 3 different mappers. So, we've got a pretty good idea of when something happens, that one of those 3 will be reporting it. Anyway, we saw yesterday that Ukrainians had a major sort of pushback here, repelling the Russians and doing a counterattack south of Novomikhailivka. And I find this incredibly good news because it's such an important settlement that it's so important that the Ukrainians keep control of it. Okay, there will be nothing much left of it. It'll be rubble, rather like Mariinka these days, but it is in a position which is useful for the Ukrainians to keep hold of. Yes, it's a buffer for everywhere else, but also it gives cover to this road. So it's a buffer to Konstantinivka, but it's a buffer to this road and stops the Russians from gaining territory and interdicting the road and then moving down the road from the northeast towards Vuhledar. So that is good news there. There's no claims about it to share with you, but nevertheless, good news, as I say. And then some Russian gains perhaps a little bit further to the south of there, as according to Deep State Maps. Again, I don't know too much detail about that. I haven't had time to look at the Institute for the Study of War today. Apologies. And then we come all the way down to Robotina, round past Velikonovo-Silka salient, or really vaguely flat line these days, to the salient at Robotina. Now, there are no mapping changes from my sources here, but there is one other source, Global War Monitor, again saying clarification of the Verbova-Novoprokopivka area of this neck of the woods has Russia has advanced across agricultural land there, so just to the west of Verbova. To be fair, that might well be what has been mapped anyway. Indeed, that does look rather like the Surat Maps' territorial control for the Russians there, as opposed to any of the other mappers. And indeed, I think Global War Monitor does rely somewhat on Surat Maps for their mapping too. Anyway, that's pretty much the entirety of the changes. There's probably lots more to say about each individual place, but I think that'll keep you going for now. Just a few bits of added analysis. So General Toplinsky, he's a commander of the Russian Airborne Forces, so the VDV, but also the regional commander for the Dnipro River grouping. He is coming under a lot of pressure, has been for a long time, pretty much since he took over, actually, because he has had a fairly good name previously, but things have not gone very well in Kherson. And actually, something I will say about Krinky here, go and check out Andrew Perpetua's video from last night. He did a video on, what's the point of Krinky? And what I love about that, it's a bit of self-congratulation. What I love about that is he said exactly what I've been saying for weeks. Like, almost verbatim. This is an instrumental use of Ukrainian soldiers in order that they attract, fix, and degrade the Russian personnel and equipment in the area. That's exactly what they're doing, exactly what they're being used for. And of course, they're not going to be too happy about that individually. So when the New York Times, again, interviews those people coming back across the river, they're going to say, it's a suicide mission, what we're doing, don't understand. But from a zoomed out position, we understand. But you don't like to tell that to your soldiers. No one likes to be told, oh, by the way, you're going to be sent across the river. There's a pretty high chance that you're going to be killed or injured, and you're basically going to be used as bait. That's really how I understand it, and that's what Andrew Perpetua said entirely in his video last night. So we're singing off the same song sheet there, which is good. But anyway, in this area, Toplinsky is coming under a lot of pressure precisely because of the tactic of the Ukrainians being so successful and the Russians losing so much equipment, having issues with counter-battery fire, with electronic warfare asymmetry, with drone asymmetry, all sorts of stuff going on. Anyway, Anton Gerashchenko says it seems that the Kremlin is trying to get rid of Russia's most influential General Toplinsky. He's very influential and popular among the Russian military. I mean, in general, he is popular, but in Krinky, he ain't so popular anymore around that area. Recently, the Russian media have resumed a campaign to discredit him after Prigozhin's mutiny and his confrontation with Shoigu and Gerasimov. Toplinsky was put under surveillance because of his ambiguous behavior. He could not be removed immediately like Surovikin because he was popular with the troops, so they decided to get rid of him gradually, first of all by destroying his image and support from the army, especially in the air forces. Some sources claim that for this purpose, a special group was created from among the officers of information counteraction of the Russian armed forces. They establish a network of channels and groups on social media that create and distribute materials aimed at discrediting Toplinsky. He was also assigned to one of the potentially most difficult areas of the war, so this is interesting. At the end of October, he became the head of the Dnipro group of troops, whose area of responsibility includes the occupied Kherson and region and part of Zaporizhia. Toplinsky has great ambitions, and he is unsuccessfully trying to eliminate our Ukrainian stronghold at any cost. That is why the Russians are suffering huge losses in equipment and personnel, especially the airborne units. Of course, this hurts Toplinsky's reputation, as previously it's believed that he valued the lives of Russian soldiers above all else. I think he was one of the chaps previously that had been complaining to Shoigu, and that's why he got into a bit of trouble, because he was seeing that his own troops that he had a good relationship with being basically sacrificed on the whim of Shoigu and Gerasimov, and he was like, this ain't cool. And then he was kind of shut down. Then he's brought back to lead the group in Dnipro, but the question is, did they bring him back in order to be able to fell him later? I mean, that sounds a bit conspiratorial, but I don't know. This is what Anton Gerashchenko is saying here. Also, Russian web pages discuss the subject of the general having two families. In addition, mental health issues are also often mentioned, which allegedly also raises questions. By the way, today he turned 55, and there are no official congratulations, which may also indicate disgrace. Interesting. So all might not be well behind the scenes there. Well, it certainly isn't in terms of the situation of the Russian troops and equipment. And another piece of analysis or news really that I find really fascinating, Zaluzhny and indeed Zelensky as well plan to launch a counteroffensive in 2022. So this is, remember, the spring-summer counteroffensive started in May 2023. This is going back to May 2022. I don't know exactly when. They wanted to isolate the Russians and occupy Crimea, but the US did not support the plan. Quote, we thought that if they bit off more than they can chew in the south, that they would get routed, the official said. Now, this in Business Insider, it just picked out a couple of paragraphs here. During discussions with Western partners for plans for a 2022 counteroffensive, Ukrainian President Zelensky and Zaluzhny, his top general, both advocated for a push down to the Sea of Azov through the Zaporizhia region. Right, so the Sea of Azov is this sea here, and through the Zaporizhia region is pretty much exactly what they've been trying to do in 2023, but failed territorially speaking. At that point, Russia had not constructed the extensive minefields and fortifications that would hinder the 2023 counteroffensive there, lightening the breaching demands. Right, so I've said many times before, is you had this dilemma. Really, the Ukrainians wanted to start the counteroffensive in spring. Well, actually, we're hearing back in 2022. So they wanted to start it as soon as possible. But of course, they didn't have the equipment and they didn't have the trained troops. So it would have caught the Russians off guard. The Russians would have been less prepared, but also the Ukrainians would have been less prepared. Is that a kind of, do they cancel each other out? So this is what I've been saying before. There's this dilemma. They could have started it previously, but both sides were kind of more in a worse position. But they waited till they were far more prepared and they had the equipment, they had the artillery ammunition. But in all that time of waiting for that equipment, the Russians built all these yellow lines, these fortifications, and they whacked a gazillion mines down. And so, again, Ukraine get better, Russia get better in terms of defense. And so, whether they chose to attack in 2022, they're both rubbish, it's like the same, or back up in 2023, they're both much better, it's the same. So I don't know. I don't know whether it would have made any tangible difference. As the article says, such an approach would have still been a daunting challenge and a gamble. The penetration would need not only be deep, but sufficiently wide to prevent the Russians from counterattacking and threatening the flanks of the advancing force. Exactly what we said about the 2023 counteroffensive. But if the Ukrainian move worked, it might have allowed the Ukrainians to capitalize on their momentum after the battle for Kiev and the Russian losses elsewhere. And Trofimov writes, quote, deprive Moscow of its biggest prize in the war. And this would have been on the back of the Kherson counteroffensive and on the back of the Kharkiv counteroffensive. So we'll never know. It's a kind of what if, but it's interesting that they were stifled from being able to do that by NATO and US advice. Probably think that was wise. I think they wouldn't have had the equipment, but you never know, because again, the Russians didn't have the fortifications, so it would have been arguably, if they could have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at it, it could have been a little bit like the Kharkiv counteroffensive, where it was lightning. It was a bit of a Thunder Road type affair where they just sort of charged through in behind the Russians because there were no fortifications. No. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all your support. Take care. Speak soon.